The bitter cold of the winter night didn't just touch the skin. It tore through muscle and sinew like a rusted saw blade. Beneath her feet, the thick, churning mud mixed with gray snow chewed at her thin velvet shoes, letting the freezing moisture seep deep into her marrow. In the heavy quiet, the sharp, burnt scent of pine smoke bled from behind the heavy oak doors of the estate. It was the scent of high-born warmth, but tonight it carried only the harsh breath of absolute rejection, casting her out into the merciless dark. The silence surrounding Clara wasn't merely the absence of sound. It pressed against her ribs like a cold iron weight, suffocating the desperate words before they could ever reach her pale lips. Her blue silk dress, once a symbol of her family's pride, now hung in ribbons. It was plastered with filth, clinging to her shivering frame. All around her, the eyes of the hired help, men and women who just yesterday had bowed their heads in deference, now threw glances thick with disgust and bitterness. The world looked at her as something soiled, a sudden blight that needed scrubbing from the marble steps of the grand house. Yet, deep within Clara's mind, there was no screaming, no frantic pleading. There was only a vast, hollowed-out expanse of ice, her trust, her devotion, her quiet dignity, all ground into the hardscrabble earth beneath the heel of a cruel betrayal. She stood there, a worn, thin shell, waiting for the north wind to scatter what little remained of her spirit into the alkali dust. Suddenly, piercing through that suffocating air of hostility, a low, rhythmic sound echoed, clang. The dull, heavy strike of an old brass sheep bell beat a slow, measured tempo, shattering the breathless grip of the courtyard. From within, the thick fog rolling down the trail, a massive shadow loomed into view, his sheer size cut through the biting north wind like an immovable stone monolith. The deep, grounding weight of his quiet presence seemed to swallow the very breath of the black night. The frost did not simply settle on the grand stone staircase of the estate. It clawed its way up the balustrades, weaving intricate, jagged patterns across the marble that looked like the skeletal fingers of the past, desperately trying to drag the present down into the frozen earth. Each gust of the north wind carried the bitter bite of alkali dust from the distant plains, stinging the raw skin of Clara's shoulders. The lanterns flickering along the portico cast long, wavering shadows that danced mockingly against the imposing facade of her childhood home. It was a house that now felt as alien and unyielding as a tomb. The heavy oak door groaned open, and the patriarch of the family, her father, stepped out into the biting chill, his face a mask of rusted iron. He did not look at her as a daughter. He looked at her as a ruined ledger, a bad investment. With a sharp, jerky motion, he tossed a burlap sack of meager, worn-thin clothes down the steps. They landed with a pathetic thud in the freezing mud at her feet. "You have brought rot to this house," her father said, his voice carrying no heat, only the hollowed-out echo of a man who cared more for his name than his own blood. "You will not step foot under this roof again. Let the winter take you." The words did not just strike Clara, they buried themselves deep into the softest parts of her memory. She remembered those same hands, now clenched in rigid fury, once lifting her up to place the star on the solstice tree. She remembered the smell of his pipe tobacco, a warm, rich scent that used to mean safety. Now, the scent of him was just bitterness and cold leather. How easily a lifetime of devotion was erased by a single, convenient lie. The realization didn't make her weep. It paralyzed her, turning her veins to ice. She wasn't losing a father. She was realizing she had never truly had one. The man on the porch was just a merchant guarding his coin, discarding defective goods. Above them, on the wrought iron balcony overlooking the courtyard, stood Julian, the man she was supposed to marry. He was wrapped in a thick, dark wool coat, a silver flask glinting in his gloved hand. The lamplight caught the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw, highlighting the smug, calculating stillness in his eyes. He was the architect of this ruin. He had gambled away the family's fortune, siphoned the estate's wealth into his own secret coffers. And when the ledgers demanded blood, he had offered Clara's virtue as the sacrifice. It brings me no joy. Clara, Julian called down, his voice projecting a masterclass in feigned sorrow, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. But a woman who seeks the beds of stable hands and drifters while her betrothed works to build a future. Such a woman cannot be a wife. You made your hardscrabble bed. Now you must lie in it. The whispers began immediately, a hissing tide rising from the courtyard perimeter. The townsfolk, the merchants, the maids, and the stable boys had gathered like vultures circling a dying calf. Their voices overlapped, weaving a thick blanket of cruelty. Always knew she was too haughty? Salt of the earth, my eye. Just a harlot wrapped in silk. Pity her father, a good man, burdened with a whore. The whispers were venomous, sinking into Clara's skin like rusted needles. Every face she looked at, faces of people she had bought bread from, people she had smiled at, people she had helped, was twisted in righteous disgust. The collective judgment of the town was a physical weight, pressing her knees toward the frozen mud. Clara started, her voice shaking, barely a breath against the wind. I did not. Julian, you know the truth of the accounts. She stopped. The stutter died in her throat as she looked up at Julian's cold, triumphant smile. Why plead with a wolf to stop being a wolf? He wasn't misunderstanding her. He was actively destroying her to save his own skin. The sheer, calculated malice of his gaze burned away the remaining fog of her shock. The trembling in her jaw hardened. She was stripped of her name, her home, and her future, but she would not give them the satisfaction of her defeat. The fear began to curdle into a stony, silent resolve. I reckon the truth will find you, she said, her voice no longer shaking. It was a steeled declaration, low and flat, meant only for the wind and the stones. Keep your stolen gold, Julian. It will buy you nothing but a heavier coffin. Julian sneered, his mask slipping for a fraction of a second before he turned his back. Throw her past the gates. If she lingers, let the dogs loose. The estate guards stepped forward, their faces obscured by the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. The crowd parted, eager to watch the disgraced daughter be dragged through the muck. The cold gripped her lungs. The silence pressed in again, thick and absolute, waiting for her final break. The guards' heavy leather boots crunched against the freezing mud as they closed the distance. One of them reached out, his thick, calloused hand aiming for the ripped collar of Clara's ruined silk dress. Clang! The single, resonant chime of the brass bell cut through the courtyard, sharp enough to sever the tension. It was followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots that did not belong on polished cobblestone. Out from the swirling, biting fog stepped the giant. He did not hurry. His pace was agonizingly slow, rhythmic, and heavy with a terrifying, grounded certainty. He was a mountain of a man, clad in a weathered canvas duster and a heavy sheepskin coat that smelled fiercely of lanolin, crushed pine needles, and the raw, unforgiving wilderness. A dense, untamed beard covered the lower half of his face, but it could not hide the jagged, pale scars that mapped the skin around his eyes, scars that spoke of avalanches and teeth, of surviving things that killed lesser men. The guard's hand stopped inches from Clara. The air in the courtyard seemed to thin, sucked into the vast, quiet gravity of the stranger's presence. The whispers of the crowd died in their throats. Elias stepped between Clara and the guards. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even raise his hands. He merely looked down at the guard, his breathing slow and steady. The rhythm of his chest, rising and falling, was like the deep, dormant pulse of the earth itself. Every time he exhaled, the frost plumed from his lips, thick and white. When he frowned, the thick scar tissue across his left cheek pulled taut, forcing his eye into a permanent, hardened squint. "Back away," Elias said. The voice was low, resembling the rumble of distant rockfall, yet it carried across the frozen yard with absolute clarity. The guard hesitated, glancing up at the balcony. Julian gripped the wrought iron railing, his aristocratic sneer faltering into genuine confusion. "Who the hell are you?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking slightly against the cold air. "This is private land. Drifter, you are trespassing on estate business. This woman is a thief and a harlot, and she owes this house for the shame she's brought and the coin she's squandered." Elias didn't look up at the balcony. He kept his gaze level, taking in the shivering, battered form of the woman at his feet. Clara stared up at him. She expected to see pity, or perhaps the same predatory hunger she had seen in the eyes of the town's merchants. Instead, she saw nothing but the vast, quiet expanse of a winter sky. His eyes were the color of slate, calm and profoundly dangerous. When he spoke, it was not to Julian, but to the father standing frozen on the porch. Elias reached into the deep pocket of his duster and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it. It hit the marble steps with a heavy, metallic clatter that echoed off the stone pillars, solid gold. "That covers whatever lies he told you she took," Elias said, his voice flat, completely devoid of anger or negotiation. "You think you can just buy her?" Julian scoffed, trying to regain his authority, though his eyes remained greedily fixed on the pouch. "She's not a prized mare, Drifter. She's ruined." Elias finally tilted his head, his slate eyes locking onto the man on the balcony. The silence he projected didn't just hang. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. "I'm not buying a servant. I'm settling a debt for a person who shouldn't have one." The words struck Clara like a sudden burst of heat against a freezing pane of glass. A person. Not a ruined ledger, not a whore. A person. The rigid, icy hold on her chest fractured, just a fraction. She watched his scarred hands, massive, rough, with knuckles like gnarled oak roots. Those hands calmly unfastened the thick, heavy sheepskin coat from his own shoulders. He knelt, the joints in his knees popping softly in the cold. Without a word, he draped the massive coat over Clara's trembling shoulders. The sheer weight of the garment almost buckled her knees, but the immediate, fierce heat of it was overwhelming. It smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and absolute safety. He didn't offer a hand to pull her up. He waited, his silence giving her the space and the dignity to find her own footing. Clara pulled the heavy collar tight around her neck. The cold wind howled, but it could no longer reach her skin. She stood, her spine straightening, leaving the torn silk and the bitter mud behind in the shadow of the giant. Elias turned his back on the estate, the gold, and the stunned, breathless crowd. He began to walk back into the fog, the brass bell resuming its slow, heavy toll. Clara didn't look back at the balcony. She didn't look at her father. She followed the rhythmic sound of the bell, stepping perfectly into the wide, deep footprints the giant left in the snow, leaving the silence of the town entirely behind her. The fog swallowed them whole, erasing the flickering gas lamps of the town within a dozen paces. The road out of the valley was not a road at all, merely a hardscrabble wagon rut carved into the frozen alkali dirt. They walked in absolute silence. The only sounds were the crunch of Elias's boots breaking the crust of the snow, the rhythmic, hollow clang of the brass sheep bell, and the ragged, shallow gasps of Clara's own breathing. The sheepskin coat was impossibly heavy. It pressed down on her fragile collarbones like an iron yoke. Yet, within its coarse, lanolin-soaked wool, she was insulated from the biting north wind. It smelled of grease, raw earth, and the sharp tang of dried sage, a scent that aggressively overwrote the lingering memory of Julian's expensive cologne. Every step was a physical negotiation. Her thin, ruined velvet shoes offered no protection against the jagged rocks and ice hiding beneath the snow. By the third mile, her toes were entirely numb. By the fifth, they burned with a fierce, agonizing fire. Elias did not slow his pace, nor did he look back to check on her. His stride was the steady, unrelenting march of a man accustomed to traversing continents on foot. He moved with a strange, liquid economy of motion, wasting no energy on the cold. When he walked, his massive shoulders barely swayed, and the thick canvas of his duster scraped against the frozen sagebrush with a dry, rhythmic hiss. He expects me to fall, Clara thought, staring at the broad expanse of his back. He bought my debt, but he expects the wilderness to claim the collateral. The thought didn't spark anger. It sparked a stubborn, bitter survival instinct. She focused entirely on placing her bleeding feet exactly into the deep, compressed boot prints he left behind. His prints were the only safe harbor in a sea of razor-sharp ice. They walked through the night and into the pale, anemic light of the morning. The landscape revealed itself not as a sanctuary, but as a wasteland. The salt valleys stretched out before them, a vast, hollowed-out basin of cracked, white earth, completely devoid of trees or shelter. The wind here didn't just blow, it scoured, picking up fine grit of salt and alkali dust that bit into any exposed skin. By noon, Clara's legs gave out. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. Her knees simply folded, refusing to bear the weight of the coat and the exhaustion any longer. She hit the frozen earth hard, the impact jarring her teeth. The brass bell stopped ringing. Elias paused. He didn't sigh. He didn't speak. He turned slowly, the heavy canvas of his coat snapping in the wind. He walked back to where she knelt in the salt dirt. He looked down at her, his slate eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his weathered hat. The thick scar on his cheek pulled tight against the cold. "I can walk," Clara managed to croak, though her throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. "Just a moment." "Why doesn't he yell?" Her internal monologue raced, frantic and exhausted. Julian would have yelled. My father would have called me weak. This silence, it's heavier than the coat. He's waiting for me to beg. Elias knelt. The joints in his knees popped, a dry, snapping sound in the quiet air. He reached out with hands the size of dinner plates. Clara flinched instinctively, anticipating a blow or a rough yank to her feet. Instead, his thick, calloused fingers bypassed her entirely, gripping the frozen, mud-caked hem of her ruined silk dress with a single, sharp jerk. He ripped a long strip of the fabric free. Before Clara could protest, he reached for her feet. He removed the remains of her velvet shoes, which were now just frozen traps of ice and blood. He didn't react to the sight of her blistered, bleeding toes. With methodical, stoic precision, he wrapped the torn silk tightly around her feet, binding them securely to ward off the frostbite. His hands were incredibly rough, the skin like cured leather. Yet his touch was surprisingly measured, lacking any cruelty. He stood up, dropping her ruined shoes into the dirt. "The silk won't last," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "But it will get you to the cabin." He turned and began walking again. The bell resumed its toll. Clara stared at her bound feet, the bright blue silk stark against the white salt dirt. He hadn't judged her weakness. He had simply provided a solution to it. She pushed herself up, the pain in her feet now a dull, manageable ache beneath the tight bindings, and forced herself to follow the giant's tracks once more. They arrived at the cabin as the sun began to bleed a violent, bruised purple across the horizon. It sat at the very edge of the valley, backed against a sheer wall of black rock. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress built against the elements. Thick, rough-hewn pine logs, chinked with hardened mud and horsehair. The roof was sod, heavy and low. A rusted iron stovepipe pierced the top, currently devoid of smoke. Elias pushed the heavy door open. It shrieked on rusted iron hinges, revealing a single, cavernous room swallowed by shadows. The air inside was colder than outside, holding the stagnant, bone-deep chill of a place that had been empty for weeks. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a rough-hewn wooden chair near a cold, iron potbelly stove. Clara moved stiffly, the sheepskin coat dragging on the rough plank floor. She collapsed into the chair, her muscles violently trembling as the adrenaline of the march finally evaporated. The silence in the cabin was absolute. There were no ticking clocks, no distant chatter of maids, no clinking of crystal glasses. The quiet was a physical entity, pressing against her ears until they rang. Elias moved with practiced efficiency. He didn't light a lantern. In the dim, dying light, he knelt before the stove. He pulled a handful of dried sage and a chunk of pine fatwood from a canvas sack. Striking a match against his thumbnail, he cupped the small flame with hands that completely shielded it from the drafts. He coaxed the fire to life. The sharp, resinous smell of burning pine filled the room, chasing away the scent of stagnant dust. As the fire caught, casting long, dancing orange shadows across the log walls, Elias stood. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt, laying the worn leather holster and the massive Colt revolver on the heavy oak table. The sound of the heavy iron hitting the wood was final. He turned to look at her. In the firelight, the jagged scars on his face looked even more pronounced. A violent map of survival. "You need water," he said. He walked to a wooden barrel in the corner, broke the layer of ice on top with the butt of his knife, and dipped a tin cup into it. He walked back and handed it to her. Clara took the cup with both hands, her fingers shaking so violently that the water sloshed over the rim, stinging her raw skin. She drank greedily. The water was agonizingly cold, tasting of tin and deep earth, but it was the best thing she had ever consumed. "Thank you," she rasped, her voice breaking. Elias didn't respond. He turned his back to her, taking a rusted iron skillet from a hook on the wall. He moved to a sack of flour resting near the stove. He saved my life, Clara thought, watching the broad line of his shoulders as he worked. But he doesn't want my gratitude. He doesn't want anything from me. I am just a debt settled, a stray dog pulled from the rain. In my father's house, I was a bargaining chip. Here, I am nothing. I am. The realization was terrifying, but beneath the fear, a strange, profound sense of relief began to take root. If she was nothing to him, then she had no expectations to fail. She was no longer Clara the heiress, the ruined bride, the disgrace. She was simply a body that needed to survive the winter. The slate had been wiped clean, scoured by the alkali wind. "Tomorrow," Elias said, his voice breaking her internal monologue. He didn't turn around, the sizzle of a piece of salt pork hitting the hot skillet drowning out the silence. "You learn to work the wool. I don't keep idle hands." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, solid and unyielding as the mountains outside. Clara looked down at her soft, pale hands, hands that had only ever held embroidery needles and porcelain cups. She slowly curled them into fists, feeling the dirt and dried blood under her nails. "I reckon I can learn," she said. It was the first time she had used the frontier phrasing without irony. It felt foreign on her tongue, but it grounded her. Elias paused, the wooden spoon stilling in the skillet for a fraction of a second. Then he resumed stirring. The crackle of the cooking meat was the only answer. But in the firelit cabin, it was enough. The morning broke not with a welcoming light, but with a pale, bruised gray that seeped through the mud chinking of the cabin walls. The frost had claimed the single, clouded window pane during the night. It did not merely freeze, it formed violent, crystalline structures that looked like the skeletal fingers of forgotten prospectors clawing at the glass, desperate to drag the meager warmth of the room out into the endless, white expanse of the alkali wasteland. Elias was already awake. He sat near the cold potbelly stove, the heavy canvas of his duster pooling around his boots. He held a pair of massive iron sheep shears and a dark gray whetstone. The sound filled the cabin, a slow, rhythmic shk, shk, shk. Clara watched him from the heavy wool blankets. She studied the extreme, deliberate economy of his movements. He didn't waste a single breath. With every scrape of the stone against the rusted iron blade, the thick cords of muscle in his forearms coiled and released. His breathing was so slow, so measured, it seemed to dictate the very pulse of the room. When he tested the blade against his thumb, pulling his jaw taut in concentration, the jagged scars across his cheek stretched white, a stark map of old violence settling into a quiet, dangerous peace. He stood, the joints in his knees offering that familiar dry snap. He walked to the bed and tossed the heavy shears onto the woolen blanket near Clara's feet. They landed with a dull, heavy thud. "The sun is up," Elias said. The sentence was a flat line, entirely devoid of inflection. "The flock needs tending. We shear. I have never held a blade," Clara stammered, staring at the rusted iron tools as if they were venomous snakes. She pulled the blanket tighter around her neck, her pale fingers trembling against the coarse wool. She took a shallow breath, the freezing air burning her lungs, and forced her chin up. "Show me how it is done, and I will not waste the fleece." The words tasted like copper in her mouth, she thought, the internal echo of her declaration ringing hollow in her own ears. In my father's house, a blade was only meant for silver platters and roasted meats. Admitting ignorance was a sin. It invited the sneers of Julian and the quiet disappointment of the men who traded our debts. But here, the silence doesn't judge my ignorance. It only demands my labor. If I fail to master this rusted iron, I am not just a disgraced daughter. I am a burden in a place where burdens are left to the winter. They walked out into the holding pens. The air tasted fiercely of salt, damp earth, and the overwhelmingly pungent odor of raw lanolin. Elias did not give her a gentle tutorial. He strode into the mass of gray, bleeding bodies, his massive hands plunging into the thick fleece of a struggling ewe. With a single fluid motion that defied his sheer bulk, he flipped the animal onto its rump, pinning it between his powerful thighs. He took the shears and began. The blades clipped with a wet, heavy crunch. He worked in long, sweeping strokes, peeling the thick, dirty wool away like a heavy winter coat to reveal the clean, white skin beneath. He did not nick the flesh once. He moved with a brutal, mesmerizing grace. Then, he stepped back, wiping the grease from the blades onto his canvas trousers, and handed the shears to her. Clara stepped into the pen. The mud sucked at her bound feet. She grabbed a smaller ewe, pulling at its fleece, but the animal thrashed wildly, its hooves kicking against her shins, bruising the bone. The sheer weight of the animal was shocking. She finally managed to wrestle it to the ground, her chest heaving, the bitter air slicing her throat. She opened the rusted shears. Her hands, pale and soft, were entirely unsuited for the heavy, stiff spring of the iron handle. She squeezed. The blades barely bit into the dense, matted wool. The resistance was immense. It felt as though she were trying to cut through a thick hawser rope with dull scissors. She squeezed again, putting the entire weight of her shoulders into her wrists. The blades snapped shut, taking a ragged, uneven chunk of fleece. By the third sheep, the skin on the inside of her thumb had blistered. By the fifth, the blister tore open, raw red flesh exposed to the freezing air and the filthy, ammonia-soaked wool. The grease of the lanolin seeped into the open wound, a stinging, fiery agony that shot straight up her forearm. The muscles in her back screamed, locked in a tight, burning spasm from being bent over the thrashing animals. She did not stop. She couldn't. Elias worked beside her, 10 sheep to her 1. His silence a heavy anvil against which she hammered her own endurance. She clipped, and she tore, and she bled. The lanolin coated her hands in a thick, yellowish wax that mixed with her own blood, turning into a grotesque, sticky paste that wouldn't wipe off. The blade stays parallel to the skin, Elias said abruptly, not looking up from his own work. You angle it. You cut the meat. You cut the meat. The blowflies come. I don't abide blowflies. My hands are slipping. Clara gasped, her chest heaving as a ewe kicked viciously, sending her sprawling backward into the muck. The salt dirt coated her face, mixing with sweat she didn't know she had the warmth to produce. She pushed herself up onto her knees, grabbing the shears from the mud with bloody, bright, trembling fingers. The blade stays parallel. I will not cut the meat. I am slipping away, she thought. The internal echo, a desperate, frantic drumbeat in her mind. The Clara who wore blue silk and drank imported tea is bleeding out into the alkali dust. The pain in my hands is blinding, a white-hot iron pressed directly to the nerve. Every time Julian's mocking voice whispers in the back of my mind, telling me I'm a useless, hollowed-out thing. I squeeze the rusted iron harder. I am shearing away the ghost of that girl with every piece of filthy wool that hits the ground. When the sun finally dipped below the black, jagged peaks, leaving the valley in freezing, bruised twilight, her hands were ruined. They were swollen, claw-like, caked in thick black grease and dried blood. She could not unbend her fingers to drop the shears. Elias had to reach over and gently pry the iron handles from her locked grip. That night, in the cabin, there was no rest. The mastery of survival demanded more. Elias set a heavy sack of coarse, unbleached flour onto the splintered oak table, followed by a tin of salt, a jug of alkali water, and an iron skillet heavy with solidified lard. Clara dragged herself to the table. Her back felt as though it had been beaten with a wooden plank. She plunged her ruined, aching hands into the flour. It felt like crushed glass against her raw blisters. The flour smelled of dry wheat, field dust, and deep earth. As she poured the water, her mind drifted unbidden to the sprawling kitchens of her father's estate. She remembered the sweet, warm voice of the old cook, teaching a young Clara how to fold sweet dough on a pristine, chilled marble counter. She remembered the smell of imported cinnamon and the soft give of butter. But there was no marble here. There was only the rough, splintering oak that caught the fabric of her dress. There was no butter. Only the heavy, dense resistance of survival bread. She began to knead. The dough was stiff, fighting back against her weakened wrists. She pushed, folded, and leaned her entire body weight into the mixture. Her shoulders screamed in protest, a sharp, tearing sensation deep in the joint. But she kept kneading, letting the coarse flour grind into the bleeding cracks of her knuckles, mixing her own blood and sweat into the dough. She carried the dough to the potbelly stove. She dropped a chunk of lard into the heavy cast-iron skillet. The crackle of the lard hitting the hot iron was violent, a sharp, spitting hiss that filled the quiet cabin. The smell of melting fat was heavy and primitive. She dropped the dough into the scorching iron. The heat from the stove radiated against her face, tight and stinging, but she didn't flinch away. She watched the edges of the bread turn a deep, golden brown, inhaling the simple, profound aroma of baked wheat and salt. It was the smell of sheer, unadulterated existence. Weeks bled into one another, measured only by the pile of shorn fleeces in the barn and the slowly dwindling sack of flour. The alkali dust settled into the pores of her skin, turning her pale complexion into a hard scrabble, weathered brown. The transformation was brutal, written entirely in the flesh. The blisters on her hands had popped, oozed, and finally hardened, thick. Yellow calluses formed over her palms and along the insides of her fingers. Her nails were chipped and permanently stained black with grease. The blue silk dress was gone, replaced by a pair of heavy canvas trousers and a flannel shirt Elias had cut down to fit her. One afternoon, a particularly massive ram broke loose from the pen. It charged toward the open valley, kicking up a trail of white salt dust. Elias was at the far end of the pasture, too far to intercept. Clara didn't shout. She didn't freeze. She dropped her bucket, her body reacting with a sudden, coiled speed she didn't know she possessed. She sprinted across the frozen ground, the heavy leather boots Elias had given her pounding a steady rhythm. She threw herself laterally, her arms wrapping around the thick, muscular neck of the ram. The momentum dragged her across the hardscrabble dirt, tearing the canvas of her trousers and scraping the skin from her forearm. But she didn't let go. She used her own weight, Twisting her hips violently, just as she had seen Elias do 1,000 times, the ram went down hard, bleeding in surprise. Clara scrambled, throwing her knee onto the animal's flank, pinning it to the earth. She held it there, chest heaving, her calloused hands gripping the thick wool with fingers made of iron. A heavy shadow fell over her. Elias stood there, a massive coil of thick hemp rope slung over his shoulder. He looked down at the pinned ram, then at the blood seeping from the long scrape on Clara's arm. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. "You've stopped bleeding on the shears," he noted, his slate eyes focusing entirely on the thick, yellow calluses of her hands gripping the fleece. "I didn't notice," Clara breathed, her voice raspy from the cold air. She tightened her grip on the ram, feeling the immense power of the animal trapped beneath her hardened knee. She looked up at him, her gaze level, the wind whipping a stray lock of dirt-caked hair across her face. "The wool comes off easier when you don't fight the animal. You just have to be heavier than its fear." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, Clara realized, her internal echo quiet and steady. It was solid. For the first time in my life, a man is looking at me not to assess my monetary value, not to judge my pedigree, and not to use me as a shield. He is looking at me, and he sees the calluses, he sees the dirt, he sees the hardscrabble truth of what I have built from nothing. I am no longer a debt. I am the master of the iron shears. Elias gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. It was the highest praise a man of the frontier could offer. He handed her the heavy coil of rope and turned back toward the barn, trusting her to secure the beast alone. The deep, rusted heart of winter had finally locked the Salt Valley in a breathless, suffocating grip. Outside the cabin, the snow did not gently fall. It was driven horizontally by a scouring north wind, packing against the heavy pine logs like a thick, white shroud meant to bury them alive. The wind howled through the mud, chinking with a high, thin shriek, sounding like a chorus of hollowed-out ghosts wandering the alkali flats. Inside, the iron pot-belly stove fought a desperate, losing battle against the encroaching dark. Its iron belly glowed a sullen, bruised red, casting long, wavering orange shadows that danced erratically across the rough-hewn walls. The air in the small room tasted of wood ash, cured leather, and the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. Clara sat on a low wooden stool drawn close to the hearth. In her lap rested a heavy pair of canvas trousers. She held a thick bone needle threaded with coarse hemp string. Weeks ago, pushing this thick needle through the stiff canvas would have driven her to tears, leaving her soft fingers bloody and ruined. Now, her hands moved with a steady, rhythmic certainty. The thick yellow calluses on her fingertips acted as natural thimbles. She pulled the hemp thread tight, the rough fiber hissing as it dragged through the canvas. She did not flinch. She was a woman remade by the hardscrabble earth, her old frailties worn thin and discarded like the torn silk she had arrived in. Across the room, sitting at the splintered oak table, was Elias. The giant was immersed in a silence so profound it seemed to have its own physical mass. He was dismantling his massive Colt revolver. The process was agonizingly slow, rhythmic, and hypnotic. He did not look at the weapon. His hands possessed a brutal, mechanical memory of every screw, spring, and cylinder. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye. She studied the extreme, deliberate economy of his movements. He held a rag soaked in pungent grease, wiping down the heavy lead barrel. With every stroke, The thick cords of muscle in his forearms coiled beneath his flannel shirt. The rhythm of his breathing matched the metallic clack of the gun parts every time a fierce gust of wind slammed against the cabin door, rattling the iron hinges, the jagged, pale scar running from his temple down into his thick beard pulled taut, forcing his slate eyes into a hardened squint. He was a man hollowed out by time and violence, filled only with the mechanical necessity of the present. "The wind bites at that one," Clara said softly. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't stutter. It resonated in the quiet room, grounded and level. She gestured with the bone needle toward her own cheek, mirroring the location of his scar. Elias paused. The oily rag stilled against the iron barrel. For a long moment, the only sound was the spit and hiss of a pine knot burning in the stove. He didn't look up from the table. "The ice leaves a memory in the meat," Elias rumbles, his voice vibrating deep in his chest like distant thunder. "The marrow remembers the freeze long after the skin heals over." Clara lowered her sewing. She stared at the embers. In my father's house, she thought, the internal echo ringing clear and cold in her mind. Men spoke of their scars as trophies. Julian boasted of a dueling nick on his wrist, a shallow scratch earned over a rigged card game to impress the town merchants. But Elias, his scars are not boasts. They are receipts. They are the brutal cost of living in a world that wanted him dead. The silence he carries isn't empty. It is a heavy iron vault, packed dense with the ghosts of the things that had tried to kill him, and the bitter weight of the things he had failed to save. "How long ago?" Clara asked. She didn't press. She simply offered the space for the words to land if he chose to drop them. Elias set the gun barrel down. The metal clinked heavily against the wood. He reached for a small, brass cleaning rod. "High pass twixt the Black Ridge and the Silver Canyon. 7 winters gone," Elias said. His sentences were short, jagged. They bled out into the room like drops of water from a frozen pump. "I wasn't always alone. Had a younger brother, Thomas. Kid had too much laugh in him for a place this rusted." He shoved the brass rod down the barrel, his massive shoulders tensing. "We were pushing a herd of 300 head before the pass closed. The mountain, it didn't give a warning, no rumble, just a sound like the whole sky cracking open down the middle. Then, the white wave." Elias stopped moving. His massive, calloused hands rested flat on the table, gripping the edges so hard his knuckles turned the color of old bone. His breathing slowed, becoming shallow, as if the air in the cabin had suddenly turned to packed snow. "I dug for 3 days," he whispered, the rumble of his voice scraping against the quiet. "Used my hands when the shovel broke. The cold, it burned until it didn't feel like cold anymore. Just felt like fire. When I finally found him beneath the ice, he was just quiet. The mountain didn't hate him, Clara. It didn't plot against us. It was just being a mountain. That is the true bitterness of the wild. There is no villain to shoot. There is no debt to collect, just the dirt and the snow and the silence." The silence in the room didn't just hang. It pressed against Clara's ribs like a cold iron weight, suffocating the words before they could reach her lips. She looked at this giant of a man, this immovable monolith of violence and grit, and saw the profound, devastating crack in his foundation. He wasn't avoiding the world because he hated it. He was avoiding it because he knew he couldn't shoot the things that truly broke a man's heart. "I used to think my father was the mountain," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, steeled murmur. The words slipped out, raw and unvarnished. "I thought his cruelty, His willingness to trade my life to cover Julian's stolen gold was just a force of nature I had to weather, a storm I couldn't fight. But men are not mountains, Elias. The wild destroys because it is indifferent. But men choose to cause the avalanche. They choose to watch you freeze. Elias slowly raised his head. For the first time in months, he looked directly into her eyes. The slate gray of his gaze was no longer just dangerous and flat. It was swimming in a deep, agonizing recognition. He looked at the calluses on her hands. He looked at the hard, weathered lines that had formed around her mouth. He saw the salt of the earth in her. The fire popped loudly, a shower of orange sparks dying on the blackened hearth. A sudden, vicious draft swept through the floorboards, causing Clara to shiver violently, her shoulders pulling inward against the biting chill. Elias stood up. The dry, familiar snap of his knee joints echoed in the room. He didn't return to cleaning his weapon. He walked over to his own narrow cot in the corner of the room. He reached down and picked up the heavy, woven Navajo wool blanket, his only true defense against the freezing nights. He walked back across the room, his heavy boots making no sound. He stopped behind her stool. Clara held her breath, entirely unsure of what this massive, scarred man was doing. Without a word. Elias unfolded the heavy wool and draped it over her shoulders. The sheer weight of the blanket pressed down on her, instantly radiating an overwhelming, fierce heat. It smelled of wood smoke, dried sage, and the deep, comforting scent of the giant himself. He didn't step back immediately. He moved around to the side of the hearth, lowering his massive frame until he was sitting on the rough plank floor, resting his forearms on his knees, just inches from where she sat. The fire only reaches so far. Elias rumbled softly, staring into the dying embers. Then, he reached out. His hand. A hand that could break a horse's neck, a hand that had dug through solid ice until the flesh tore, moved with agonizing slowness. His thick, rough thumb gently brushed against her cheek, wiping away a smear of black soot from the stove. The touch was fleeting, lasting barely a second. But it was electric. His skin was like cured leather. Rough and unyielding, yet the motion was so incredibly tender it felt devastating. I expected a hardened world to break me, Clara thought, her chest tightening with an emotion entirely foreign to the bitter valley. I expected the alkali dust to scour away my soul until there was nothing left but bitterness. I never reckoned that in the deepest, most hollowed-out part of the frontier, I would find a man who knew exactly how much the cold hurt, and yet chose to give away his own warmth. He is not just sheltering me. He is finally letting himself be seen. Clara did not pull away from his touch. She leaned imperceptibly into the heavy wool blanket, her gaze fixed on the glowing red coals, sharing the quiet warmth of a hardscrabble piece they had forged together from the ruin of their pasts. As the fire burns down to embers in the silent cabin, a heavy question hangs in the cold frontier air. If the world stripped you of your name, your wealth, and your voice, leaving you with nothing but the clothes on your back, would you have the grit to forge a new soul in the alkali dust, or would you surrender to the avalanche if you respect the hardscrabble path? If you believe in the quiet strength of those who endure, hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Share your own scars. And now, let us return to the valley, where the past is about to knock on the cabin door. The deep winter began to fracture, but it did not yield to a gentle, forgiving spring. Instead, the Salt Valley offered a brutal, deceitful thaw. The thick ice clinging to the jagged black rocks of the western ridge did not melt smoothly. It splintered, sending heavy, crystalline shards crashing down into the valley floor with the sudden, sharp sound of breaking bones. The wind shifted direction, losing its high, howling shriek, but gaining a heavy, suffocating dampness. It smelled of rotting sagebrush, stagnant water, and the ancient, bitter salt of the earth. The ground beneath the cabin transformed. The frozen, hardscrabble dirt turned into a treacherous mire. It was a sucking, gray alkali mud that clung to boots and hooves like desperate, starving hands, trying to pull everything living down into the dark. Clara stood near the holding pens, the heavy sheepskin coat pushed back off her shoulders as she worked. She swung a heavy iron mallet, driving a thick wooden stake into the muck to reinforce the rotting fence line. Her breathing was steady, synchronized with the heavy thud of the iron hitting the wet wood. Her hands, thick with yellow calluses and stained with grease, gripped the handle with an effortless mechanical strength. She did not feel the freezing dampness seeping through her canvas trousers. She was entirely grounded in the rhythm of the labor. Then, a foreign sound cut through the heavy, damp air. It was not the slow, measured clang of Elias's brass sheep bell, nor the rustling of the flock. It was the frantic, sucking noise of multiple horses being spurred mercilessly through the deep mud. The sound was chaotic, desperate, carrying the violent energy of men fighting against the landscape rather than moving with it. Clara lowered the mallet. She turned slowly, her heavy boots sinking an inch into the muck. 4 riders emerged from the thick, gray mist rolling off the valley floor. The horses were lathered in white, freezing sweat, their eyes wide and rolling with exhaustion, their flanks bleeding from the constant, cruel bite of silver spurs. At the front rode Julian. The sight of him did not send a shock of terror through Clara's veins. Instead, it brought a profound, chilling clarity. He was a man hollowed out by his own greed. The expensive, tailored, dark wool coat he had worn on the balcony that fateful night was now ruined, caked with dried alkali dust and splashed with foul mud. His pristine, aristocratic features were drawn tight, pinched with exhaustion and the frantic, rabid energy of a cornered animal. The silver flask was gone. The smug, calculating stillness in his eyes had been replaced by a feral, darting desperation. He looked worn thin, a man whose elaborate lies had finally collapsed under their own weight, leaving him with nothing but a desperate, gnawing hunger. Behind him rode 3 men. They did not sit in their saddles like frontiersmen. They slouched, hard-eyed and twitchy. They smelled of cheap, unaged liquor, wet wool, and stale sweat. They were hired thugs, scavengers bought with the last desperate coins of a ruined estate. I used to think he was a giant, Clara thought, the internal echo ringing in her mind with a cold, absolute calm. In the grand drawing rooms of my father's house, his voice filled the space, and his approval dictated my worth. I thought he held the keys to the world. I thought his cruelty was a storm I simply had to weather. But looking at him now, shivering in the saddle, his fine clothes rotting in the damp, he is not a giant. He is just a frightened boy playing a rigged game, terrified of the hardscrabble earth. He looks so incredibly small against the backdrop of the mountain. Julian pulled his exhausted horse to a halt 10 paces from the fence. He stared at Clara, his eyes sweeping over her mud-caked boots, her coarse canvas trousers, and the heavy, rusted iron mallet resting easily in her calloused hands. A flicker of profound confusion crossed his face. quickly buried under a sneer of defense. "It's a long way from the parlor, Clara," Julian said, though the words lacked their former venom. His voice was ragged, fighting a losing battle against the vast, swallowing silence of the valley. "You look like a common field hand. I suppose the mud suits your true nature." "The mud is honest," Clara replied. Her voice did not shake. It did not begin with a stutter. It was a steeled declaration, pitched low and carrying the same flat, dangerous cadence she had absorbed from Elias. The words did not invite an argument. They simply stated a fact, solid and unyielding. Julian flinched at the tone, gripping his reins tighter. "Your arrogance is misplaced. The estate is gone. Clara, your father's ledgers were complicated. The bank seized the house, the lands, the imported silver. The old man is sitting in a rented room, coughing up blood. But they didn't seize the dowry flock. Those sheep belong to the estate. They belong to me." Clara did not move. She felt the heavy handle of the iron mallet against her palm. "You threw me into the street. You stood on a balcony and told the town I brought rot to the house. You traded my name to hide your theft, and now you come crawling twixt the mountains through the alkali to steal the only thing that kept me alive?" Julian reached inside his ruined coat. He pulled out a crumpled, heavy piece of parchment, sealed with the red wax of the county court. He held it up like a shield. "I have a writ of seizure from the county judge," Julian yelled, his voice cracking, pitching higher as the wind began to pick up. "Legal claim to the flock. It is signed and sealed. You are a trespasser harboring stolen goods. We are taking the sheep. Clara, if you or your savage drifter interfere, these men have the right to arrest you. Or worse." A piece of paper, Clara thought, staring at the red wax. A few months ago. A piece of paper with a signature dictated whether I lived in a mansion or froze in the street. A piece of paper told the world I was a whore, and the world believed it. But out here, what does paper mean to the winter? What does wax mean to the wolves? He thinks he brought the rules of the town into the valley. He doesn't realize the valley has no rules. Behind Clara, the heavy oak door of the cabin groaned open. The sound was agonizingly slow, deliberate, and final. Elias stepped out into the mud. He didn't rush. He walked with that terrifying, rhythmic certainty, his boots sinking deep into the muck, but never slowing his stride. He did not wear his heavy duster. He wore only a thick flannel shirt that strained against the massive, coiled muscles of his shoulders and chest. He carried no rifle in his hands, yet he projected a violence so absolute it made the air feel suddenly thin. His slate eyes locked onto the riders. The silence he brought with him didn't just hang. It pressed against the chests of the hired men. A heavy iron weight that made their horses dance nervously, throwing their heads and biting at the bits. Julian's horse took a step backward. "I have a writ. Drifter," Julian repeated, his voice wavering badly. He shook the paper at Elias. "The law is on my side." Elias stopped 5 paces from the fence. He did not look at the paper. He did not look at Julian. He looked at the 3 hired thugs. He studied them with the cold, detached calculation of a butcher assessing meat. The jagged scars across his face pulled tight. He stood perfectly balanced in the treacherous mud, immovable. "Paper doesn't bleed," Elias rumbled. The voice vibrated deep in his chest, a sound like distant rockfall. "But men do." One of the thugs, a man with a scarred lip, nervously dropped his hand toward the heavy revolver resting in his holster. Elias didn't draw a weapon, but the subtle shift in his stance, a slight dropping of his center of gravity, a tightening of his jaw, communicated that if that gun cleared the leather, the man would not live to pull the trigger. The thug froze, his hand hovering over the grip. He looked at Elias's eyes, saw the absolute hardscrabble emptiness there, and slowly moved his hand back to the reins. "We take them at dawn." Julian spat, realizing his hired muscle was faltering under the weight of the giant's silence. He shoved the writ back into his coat, his hands shaking. "We make camp at the ridge. When the sun comes up, we drive the flock out. If you stand in the way, the law says we can shoot you where you stand." He jerked his horse around savagely, the spurs drawing fresh blood. The three thugs eagerly followed, desperate to escape the suffocating pressure of the cabin yard. They rode back toward the tree line, leaving deep, muddy scars in the earth. Clara watched them go. She did not drop the iron mallet. She turned to look at Elias. The giant was staring up at the western peaks. The gray mist was thickening, turning into a bruised, violent purple. The temperature was dropping rapidly, freezing the mud back into jagged, treacherous spikes. "They won't wait for the sun," Elias said softly, his breath pluming white in the suddenly freezing air. "And neither will the sky. The mountain is waking up. The sky did not simply lose the sun, it suffocated it. A bruised, violent purple swallowed the western ridge, rapidly curdling into an absolute, crushing blackness. The temperature did not drop gradually. It plummeted with the vicious, indiscriminate speed of a falling iron blade. The churning, treacherous mud that Julian and his thugs had torn up froze solid in a matter of minutes, turning the yard into a landscape of jagged, ankle-breaking spikes. The wind, which had been a heavy, damp presence, transformed into a physical, concussive force. It roared down the narrow throat of the salt valley with a deafening shriek, sounding like 1,000 rusted train cars violently grinding against their tracks. The blizzard did not fall as delicate snowflakes. It fired horizontal sheets of pure, razor-sharp ice that scoured the bark from the deadwood pines and threatened to flay the skin from any living thing that dared to step outside. Inside the cabin, the heavy log walls groaned, a deep, structural agony as the storm hammered against the mud chinking. Clara stood by the door, her hands wrapped tight around the iron latch. She could feel the violent vibration of the wood humming through her calloused palms. In my father's house, she thought, the internal echo ringing with a cold, steeled clarity. A storm like this meant drawing the heavy velvet curtains and ordering the servants to pile more coal onto the roaring hearth. We bought our safety with silver and ignored the world outside. We believed the thick stone walls made us untouchable. But the stone was a lie. Julian's betrayal proved that the rot was already inside the house. Here, in the hardscrabble dirt. There are no velvet curtains to hide behind. The wild does not care about your pedigree. You either brace the door with your own weight, or the wind takes everything. A high, panicked sound pierced the howling gale. It was the flock, 300 sheep, their instincts screaming as the temperature dropped past the point of endurance. But beneath their terrified bleating, there was another sound, a low, rhythmic resonance that vibrated up through the frozen earth itself. Clara looked at Elias. The giant was already moving. He did not throw on his heavy canvas duster. The wind would only catch it and drag him down. He wore only his flannel shirt, a thick wool vest, and his heavy leather gloves. He strapped his heavy gun belt over his hips, the massive Colt revolver a dark anchor against the storm. He tossed Clara her sheepskin coat. "Wolves," Elias said. The word was a flat, jagged rock dropped into the quiet of the cabin. The freeze drove the elk down. The elk drove the pack. They smell the flock. He didn't wait for her to reply. He shoved the heavy oak door open. The blizzard instantly invaded the room, killing the fire in the potbelly stove and plunging the cabin into freezing darkness. Clara didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy, lanolin-soaked coat over her shoulders, grabbed a coil of thick hemp rope and a heavy iron crowbar from the corner, and followed him into the maw of the storm. The cold was absolute. It hit her lungs like inhaled glass. The wind was so powerful she had to lean forward at a sharp angle just to remain standing, her boots searching for purchase on the frozen, jagged mud. Elias was a massive, blurry shadow 10 paces ahead. He moved with a brutal, mechanical determination, ignoring the ice that immediately coated his beard and eyelashes. They reached the holding pens. The sheep were packed tightly into a corner, a vibrating mass of dirty gray wool, crushing each other in a desperate bid for warmth. At the edge of the tree line, just beyond the perimeter fence, Clara saw them, low, sleek shadows darting through the swirling snow. Dozens of them, eyes burning with a pale, starved yellow light. The pack was massive, hollowed out by the winter, driven by a primal, rabid hunger that the wind could not deter. "Hold the lantern!" Elias roared over the wind, thrusting a heavy brass oil lamp into her hands. "Don't let the glass crack!" Clara gripped the brass ring with both hands. The metal was agonizingly cold, burning through her thin gloves, but her grip, forged by weeks of shearing wool, was absolute iron. She held the light high, casting a wavering, desperate yellow circle against the encroaching dark. Elias moved to the main gate. The heavy wooden crossbeam was splintering under the pressure of the panicked flock, pressing against it from the inside, while the wind battered it from the outside. He shoved his massive shoulder against the timber, his boots slipping on the ice. The muscles in his back coiled tightly, fighting a desperate, losing battle against the sheer weight of the panicked animals. "Bring the chain!" he shouted, his voice a guttural scrape against the howling storm. Clara dropped the rope, keeping the lantern raised in one hand while dragging a heavy length of rusted iron chain through the snow with the other. She waded into the fray, the sheep pressing violently against her legs. She ignored the bruising impacts. She reached the gate, wrapping the heavy chain around the splintering post, her bare fingers slipping on the freezing iron links. She didn't feel the skin tear. She only felt the mechanical necessity of the lock. Elias grabbed the other end of the chain, hauling it tight with a violent jerk that snapped a link into place. Then the calamity struck. It was not the wolves, it was the mountain. On the steep ridge directly above the pens, a massive, ancient deadwood pine had stood for a century, its roots clinging to the hardscrabble rock. The combination of the sudden freeze and the concussive force of the wind was too much. The root system shattered with a sound like a cannon shot. The massive timber plummeted downward, accelerating through the darkness. Elias heard the crack. He looked up, the snow whipping across his scarred face. He saw the descending shadow. He didn't dive for safety. In that split second, he saw young Yu, pressed against the fence, directly in the path of the falling trunk. With a violent, explosive surge of movement, Elias lunged. He hit the ewe with his shoulder, sending the animal tumbling into the safety of the herd. But he was a fraction of a second too slow to save himself. The massive pine trunk crashed into the top rail of the fence, shattering the thick oak like kindling. The heavy, jagged end of the tree violently struck the frozen earth, and the sheer momentum swung the trunk laterally. It caught Elias across the right thigh and knee. The sound of the impact was sickening. A deep, wet crunch of shattering bone that was somehow louder than the shrieking wind. Elias was thrown backward into the snow. The massive weight of the tree trunk settled directly across his crushed leg, pinning him to the frozen alkali dirt. He didn't scream. The silence of the giant held, even in agony. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven violently from his lungs in a white plume. His jaw locked instantly, the muscles in his neck popping out like steel cables. His hands clawed into the frozen dirt, his slate eyes squeezing shut as a tremor of absolute, blinding pain racked his massive frame. "Elias!" Clara screamed, the sound tearing her throat raw. She dropped the lantern. The glass didn't break. She threw herself through the deep snow, falling to her knees beside him. The sight was horrific. The heavy canvas of his trousers was already turning a dark, slick crimson. The angle of his leg beneath the massive log was completely unnatural. The giant, the immovable force that had stood between her and the cruelty of the world, was pinned, broken, and bleeding out into the snow. "He is going to die," the internal echo whispered. A cold, terrifying voice that sounded exactly like Julian's smug sneer. "You are alone again. Clara, the giant is fallen. The wolves are coming. The men are waiting. You are nothing but a disgraced girl in a ruined dress, playing in the dirt. Run. Let the winter take him. Let the wolves take the flock. Save yourself." Clara stared at Elias's face. He opened his eyes, looking up at her through the driving snow. His breathing was shallow, jagged, his face pale beneath the heavy beard. He didn't ask for help. He didn't beg. He reached a trembling, blood-stained hand toward his holster, struggling to unclip the heavy leather strap. He was preparing to die, fighting from his back. Clara felt a profound, violent shift within her chest. The hollowed-out space that had once held her fear and her ruined pride suddenly filled with a white-hot, steeled rage. The terrified girl from the estate was dead. She reached down and grabbed his wrist, stopping his hand from drawing the revolver. Elias looked at her, confusion bleeding through the pain. Clara didn't say a word to him. She let go of his wrist and stood up. She turned her back on the broken giant, facing the howling darkness of the tree line. The pale yellow eyes of the wolf pack were moving closer, emboldened by the scent of fresh blood. She reached down into the snow and picked up the heavy iron crowbar she had brought from the cabin. The metal was freezing, heavy, and rusted. It felt perfect in her calloused hands. She was no longer the mistake. She was the guardian. The wolves moved not as individual beasts, but as a single, fluid shadow spilling across the frozen alkali dirt. Their pale yellow eyes cut through the driving snow, fixated entirely on the dark crimson blood seeping from Elias's crushed leg into the white drifts. The wind howled, a deafening, concussive shriek that sought to swallow any sound of resistance, ripping the heat from the air. Clara stood squarely between the fallen giant and the encroaching tree line. In her right hand, the heavy iron crowbar felt like an extension of her own bone. Heavy and absolute, in her left, the brass lantern swung wildly, throwing frantic, jagged arcs of yellow light against the suffocating dark. The lead wolf, a massive, starved timber wolf with silver-tipped fur and ribs showing painfully through its coat, broke from the pack. It lunged, its jaws snapping with a wet, heavy click aimed directly at Elias's exposed throat. Clara did not step back. She did not scream. She stepped forward, her heavy leather boots planting firmly in the treacherous, icy mud. She didn't swing the crowbar blindly. She swung it with the precise, brutal, mechanical efficiency she had learned from driving the heavy wooden fence posts into the hardscrabble earth. The rusted iron connected with the side of the wolf's jaw with a sickening, solid crack. The impact sent a violent tremor all the way up her arm, settling deep into her shoulder joint, but she did not let go. The wolf yelped, a high, sharp sound that was quickly swallowed by the blizzard and was thrown sideways into a deep snowdrift. The pack halted instantly, their predatory rhythm broken. They circled just at the edge of the lantern light, assessing this new, unexpected obstacle. They were looking at a creature that smelled of fear and blood, but moved with the terrifying Spheren's grounded weight of the mountain itself. In my father's house, Clara thought, the internal echo ringing in her mind with a cold, steeled clarity. I was taught that survival meant shrinking. It meant lowering my eyes, softening my voice, and waiting for the men in the room to decide my fate. Julian taught me that weakness was a woman's natural state. But the winter does not care about manners. The wolf does not negotiate with the meek. The only language the wild understands is the weight of your defiance. I will not shrink. I will take up all the space the darkness allows. She didn't wait for their calculation to end. Clara raised the brass lantern high above her head. With a sudden, vicious downward motion, she hurled it directly at the frozen ground in front of the pack. The thick glass shattered. The kerosene exploded outward in a brilliant, searing wall of orange flame. The fire caught the dry, deadwood sagebrush buried beneath the snow, instantly creating a blazing barrier. The sharp, resinous smell of burning pine pitch and oil filled the freezing air, choking the oxygen. The wolves recoiled, their instincts overriding their rabid hunger as the intense heat blistered against their muzzles. They turned, melting back into the blackness of the tree line, leaving nothing but the roar of the wind and the crackle of the flames. Clara immediately spun back to Elias. The giant was barely conscious, his breathing a shallow, ragged rasp that plumed white in the freezing air. The massive pine trunk was immovably settled across his leg, pressing him into the frozen dirt. I cannot lift it. Elias ground out, his voice barely a vibration against the howling gale. The thick, jagged scar on his cheek was stark white against his pale skin, his eyes heavy with the shadow of shock. I reckon you don't have to, Clara said. Her voice was a flat line. She jammed the flattened end of the heavy iron crowbar under the thickest part of the trunk. She looked around frantically, the wind biting at her eyes, until she spotted a large, jagged piece of the shattered oak fence rail. She kicked it under the crowbar, wedging it deep into the mud to create a crude but unyielding fulcrum. She pressed her thick, calloused hands against the freezing cold iron of the bar. She remembered the sheer, agonizing resistance of the ewes she had wrestled to the ground, learning to be heavier than their panic. She remembered the heavy, unyielding dough she had kneaded for hours until the muscles in her back screamed in protest. She did not rely on her arms. She relied on her core, her hips, the solid grounding of her boots against the earth. She threw her entire body weight onto the end of the crowbar. The rusted iron bent slightly under the immense strain. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deep, agonizing groan of protesting wood, the massive pine trunk began to shift. It lifted an inch, then two. Pull! Clara screamed. The muscles in her neck pulled taut as steel cables, her jaw locked in absolute exertion. Elias dug his massive, blood-stained hands into the frozen mud and dragged his upper body backward. The crushed leg scraped against the earth, tearing a low, guttural groan of pure agony from his throat. But he cleared the timber. Clara released her weight from the crowbar. The heavy log slammed back down, shaking the ground with a final, hollow thud. She fell to her knees beside him. The canvas of his trousers was completely soaked through, turning a dark, freezing black in the night. She did not hesitate, her movements clinical and fast. She ripped the heavy wool scarf from her own neck, wrapped it tightly above his ruined knee, and used a broken splinter of the fence to twist it into a brutal, unforgiving tourniquet. The bleeding slowed to a seep. "The cabin," she breathed, dragging his massive, heavy arm over her shoulders. She became the crutch for the mountain. Step by agonizing step, fighting the concussive force of the howling wind, she hauled the broken giant back into the dark, freezing safety of the cabin walls. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the salt valley buried under a suffocating, blinding white silence. The sky was the color of bruised slate, anemic light reflecting off the endless drifts. Inside the cabin, Clara had dragged Elias to his narrow cot. She had relit the fire, the iron pot-belly stove radiating a desperate, localized heat. Her hands were caked in dried blood, soot, and black lanolin grease. She had not slept a single second. She stood perfectly still by the frosted window pane, watching the trail out of the valley. They came exactly as Julian promised. 4 horses struggled through the deep, fresh drifts, their breath pluming like steam engines. Julian rode at the front, his face wrapped in a ruined silk scarf, his eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by the brutal night. His hired thugs looked frozen, miserable, and deeply resentful, their hands tucked deep into their armpits for warmth. They rode with the arrogance of scavengers, expecting to find nothing but a frozen corpse and a cowering, weeping girl ready to surrender her flock. Clara did not wait for them to knock. She did not hide behind the heavy oak door. She opened it smoothly and stepped out onto the rough-hewn planks of the porch. The morning cold hit her, sharp as a razor, but she didn't shiver. She stood tall, the heavy sheepskin coat draped over her shoulders like a mantle of authority. In her right hand, she did not hold a firearm. She held the massive, rusted iron sheep shears she had mastered over the long, brutal weeks. The blades were closed, pointed downward, but the sheer size and weight of the tool, held so effortlessly in her blood-stained, heavily calloused hand, communicated a terrifying raw competence. Her face was streaked with ash and dried blood. Her eyes were hard, flat, and completely devoid of fear. Julian pulled his exhausted horse to a halt. The triumphant sneer he had prepared died instantly on his chapped lips. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw an absolute stranger. This was not the fragile heiress he had ruined. This was a creature of the frontier, forged in fire, ice, and labor. We have come for the flock," Julian stammered, his voice weak, failing miserably to carry in the heavy, snow-muffled air. "Where's the drifter? Tell him to stand down. We have the writ." Clara did not raise her voice. She spoke with a low, steeled resonance that cut through the morning chill with devastating clarity. "The writ is paper. Paper does not survive the winter," she said. She took one slow, deliberate step forward, the heavy wood of the porch groaning under her boots. "The giant is resting. You will not disturb him, and you will not touch the flock." One of the hired thugs, the man with the scarred lip, urged his horse a half step forward. He looked at Clara, then at the heavy iron shears in her hand. He had expected to shoot a man. He hadn't expected to fight a woman who looked like she had just crawled out of a mass grave and didn't care if she sent him to one. "Listen here, little lady." The thug started, his hand drifting nervously toward his gun belt. "If you pull that iron—" Clara interrupted, her voice perfectly level, the tone as dry and hard as the alkali dirt. "You had better aim true, because if you miss, I will use these shears to open you from your throat to your belt, and I will leave your meat for the wolves that are waiting just past the tree line." She didn't blink. She didn't shift her weight. She stood there, an immovable monolith of violence and grit, absorbing the absolute silence of the valley and throwing it back at them. I am no longer Clara the victim. The internal echo pulsed steadily. I am the silence that answers their threats. I am the rusted iron that cuts the rot away. The thug froze. He looked into her slate-like eyes, saw the absolute truth of her promise, and slowly raised his hands, backing his horse away. The hardscrabble reality of the frontier had completely broken his nerve. There was no money worth dying for in this frozen wasteland. "Julian," Clara said, turning her gaze back to her former betrothed. He looked incredibly small, a worn, thin shadow shivering in his ruined coat. "The estate is gone. Your honor is gone. If you step off that horse, I will ensure your life goes with them. Ride back to the town. Tell them the daughter they threw into the dirt learned how to be the mountain." Julian stared at her, his jaw trembling. The last remnants of his arrogant facade crumbled into dust, leaving only the terrified, hollowed-out boy beneath. He looked at his thugs, who were already turning their horses around, eager to escape the suffocating pressure of the cabin yard. Without a word, Julian pulled his reins. He turned his horse and followed his hired men, retreating back into the endless white drifts, a ruined man fleeing from the terrifying guardian he had inadvertently created. Clara watched them until they were swallowed by the blinding expanse. She didn't drop the iron shears. She simply turned and walked back into the cabin, closing the heavy oak door against the winter, sealing the warmth and her hardscrabble piece safely inside. The spring thaw did not arrive in the Salt Valley with the gentle blooming of wildflowers. It came as a violent, tearing flood that ripped the hardscrabble earth open, leaving deep, bleeding trenches of rusted clay and thick alkali mud. The road back to the town of Oakhaven was a treacherous, sucking mire that threatened to swallow wagon wheels whole. But the heavy, iron-reinforced timber wagon did not falter. It was pulled by 4 massive draft mules, their coats thick and steaming in the crisp morning air, their immense shoulders leaning into the heavy leather harnesses with a rhythmic, mechanical certainty. Clara held the thick leather reins. She sat high on the wooden bench, her posture perfectly straight, absorbing the brutal jolts of the rutted road without a flinch. She wore her heavy canvas trousers, thick leather boots, and the massive sheepskin coat that smelled fiercely of wood smoke and raw lanolin. Her face was tanned to a weathered, deep bronze by the alkali wind, her jaw set with a quiet, immovable weight. Beside her on the bench lay the rusted iron shears and the heavy crowbar. In the back of the wagon, stacked high and bound tightly with coarse hemp rope, were the fleeces. 300 heavy, pristine bales of winter wool, thick and dense with the survival of the bitterest freeze in a decade. In my father's house, Clara thought, the internal echo entirely devoid of its former bitterness, sounding now only like a factual history of a stranger. I used to ride into this town in a lacquered carriage with velvet seats. I used to worry if the dust would settle on my silk hem, or if the merchants would notice a stray hair out of place. I thought this town was the entire world. I thought its whispers were the absolute judgment of God. But looking at it now, as it crests the horizon, it is so incredibly small. It is just a collection of rotting wood and frightened people huddled together, terrified of the wind. The wagon crested the main street of Oakhaven. The heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the draft mule's hooves on the muddy cobblestones acted like a tolling bell, drawing the townsfolk from the safety of their shops and saloons. The town had survived the winter, but it looked worn thin, hollowed out by the cold and economic stagnation. The whispers began, just as they had on the night of her exile, a hissing tide rising from the boardwalks. But the tone had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer the venomous, righteous disgust of a mob smelling blood. It was the hushed, breathless sound of profound shock. They remembered the weeping, ruined girl in the torn blue silk. They did not recognize the terrifying grounded monolith of a woman driving the heavy freight wagon. Clara pulled the reins, halting the massive team directly in front of the town's primary mercantile and wool exchange. She didn't wait for a stable boy. She wrapped the thick leather reins around the iron brake lever, stood up, and jumped down into the ankle-deep spring mud. The heavy thud of her boots silenced the immediate vicinity. She walked to the back of the wagon, pulled a heavy iron hook from her belt, and sank it into the thick burlap of the nearest wool bale. With a single, fluid heave that engaged the coiled muscles of her back and shoulders, she dragged the 200-pound bale off the wagon, letting it slam onto the wooden boardwalk with a bone-rattling crash. The wool broker, a fleshy man who had once eagerly gossiped about her ruin, scurried out of his shop, his eyes wide as he stared at the sheer volume and quality of the fleece. "I reckon you buy wool," Clara said. Her voice was pitched low, a flat, hardscrabble rumble that carried the same terrifying stillness as the giant she had left resting in the cabin. Yes, miss, yes," the broker stammered, pulling a brass knife to cut the hemp binding. He pulled a handful of the fleece. His hands shook. The wool was incredibly dense, coated in a thick, protective layer of natural grease. I have never seen winter fleece of this grade. The length of the staple. It survived the blizzard? It did not just survive, Clara stated, her slate-like eyes locking onto the nervous man. It adapted. Weigh it. As the heavy iron scales began to clank and groan under the massive weight of the harvest, the crowd parted. From the shadows of the apothecary's awning across the street, a pathetic, stooped figure emerged. It was a man wrapped in a soiled, moth-eaten blanket, his chest heaving with a deep, wet, rattling cough. His face was a map of gray, sunken flesh and desperate, hollowed-out eyes. It was her father. Behind him, holding a cheap tin cup and sweeping the muddy boardwalk of the saloon for pennies, stood Julian. The fine, aristocratic sneer was entirely gone. His hands, once manicured and soft, were trembling violently from the lingering sickness of cheap, unaged liquor. He looked at Clara, the broom slipping from his grasp and falling into the muck. The absolute silence in the street didn't just hang. It pressed against the chests of the townsfolk like a cold iron weight, suffocating their breaths. Her father took a trembling step toward the wagon. "Clara?" he rasped, his voice a pathetic, wheezing scrape against the quiet air. "Daughter, is it truly you?" "The bank." Julian lied. "They took everything. We have nothing but the clothes on our backs. We are freezing. Clara." He reached a shaking, skeletal hand out toward the sleeve of her heavy sheepskin coat. Clara did not step back. She did not flinch. She simply looked down at the trembling hand with the detached, clinical calculation of a butcher assessing spoiled meat. She saw the hands that had once tossed a burlap sack of rags at her feet. She saw the hands that had traded her dignity to save a ledger. "You do not have a daughter," Clara said. Her voice did not rise. It did not carry an ounce of anger or vindictive joy. It was simply the absolute, heavy truth, cold as glacier water. "You threw your daughter to the winter. The winter kept her." Julian stumbled forward, falling to his knees in the deep, sucking mud just inches from Clara's boots. "Clara, please," he begged, the tears cutting clean tracks through the thick grime on his face. "I was a fool. The town knows the truth now. They know I forged the ledgers. They know you were innocent. Forgive me. Share the bounty of the flock. You have so much. Just a fraction could buy us passage out of this rusted town." He expects me to weep, Clara thought, the internal echo steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. He expects me to feel the sting of vindication, to revel in his humiliation, or to succumb to the soft, foolish mercy I was taught in the parlor. He thinks his suffering somehow balances the scales, but the scales are iron, and they only weigh the truth. His apologies are just more words, and words do not stop the avalanche. Words do not mend a shattered leg. Words do not chop the wood. Clara looked out over the kneeling man, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the townsfolk, the merchants, the gossips, the silent accomplices who had eagerly consumed her ruin. "You trade in rumors and paper," Clara said, her voice projecting across the square, a steeled declaration that left no room for debate. "You build your houses on ledgers and lies, and when the wind blows, you turn on each other like starving dogs. You stood in this mud and called me a whore because a thief told you to. You watched a man throw his own blood to the wolves, and you nodded your heads." She reached into her heavy canvas pocket and pulled out the small, heavy leather pouch of gold coins, the exact pouch Elias had thrown onto the marble steps months ago to buy her debt. She untied the thick leather cord. "Julian," Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet rumble. "You traded my life to hide your theft. You owe this town a debt you can never repay with a broom." She turned the pouch over. The heavy, solid gold coins spilled out, but she did not drop them into his waiting, trembling hands. She let them fall directly into the deep, churning alkali mud at his knees. They hit the muck with a heavy, final thwack. Thwack, thwack, instantly sinking out of sight into the freezing dirt. Julian gasped, plunging his bare, freezing hands elbow-deep into the mud, desperately digging like a rabid animal for the lost gold, weeping openly in front of the entire town. Her father collapsed onto the boardwalk, sobbing into his dirty blanket. Clara did not watch them dig. She turned her back on the ruin. The wool broker, shaking uncontrollably, handed her a thick stack of heavy banknotes and a large canvas sack of silver dollars, the true, hardscrabble value of the winter fleece. "It is all there, ma'am," the broker whispered, terrified to make eye contact. "Every cent, a fair price." "A fair price," Clara repeated flatly. She took the money, stuffing it deep into the heavy pockets of her duster. She walked back to the wagon, pulling herself up onto the high wooden bench with a smooth, practiced motion. She unwrapped the heavy leather reins from the iron brake. She looked one last time at the town square. The people were frozen in place, staring at the mud where a ruined man dug for buried coins. They were trapped in their rusted, petty world. Clara snapped the reins. The massive draft mules lunged forward, the heavy wagon groaning as it pulled free of the town's mud. She did not look back. She drove the wagon toward the western ridge, toward the blinding white peaks, carrying the quiet of the mountain and the absolute, unyielding peace of the guardian back to the giant waiting in the valley. 7 winters had scoured the salt valley since the day Clara drove the heavy freight wagon out of the town's rotting mud. The seasons in the frontier did not turn with gentle apologies. They hammered the earth, testing the metal of everything that dared to take root. Yet, the valley was no longer a hollowed-out basin of cracked alkali dust and bitter silence. It had been broken, tamed, and rebuilt by hands that refused to surrender to the freeze. The original, rough-hewn pine cabin still stood, but it was now merely the heart of a sprawling, hardscrabble fortress, heavy river stone, hauled one excruciating wagon load at a time from the western ridge, had been mortared around the timber, creating thick, unyielding walls that absorbed the howling wind without a single structural groan. The sod roof was gone, replaced by thick, overlapping cedar shakes that weathered to a proud, steely gray. Beyond the expanded porch, the holding pens had multiplied. The flock of 300 had swelled to over 2,000 head, a vast, undulating sea of premium gray wool that grazed on acres of resilient, irrigated sweetgrass, their brass bells creating a constant, rhythmic, and heavy music that echoed twixt the canyon walls. Inside the sprawling main room of the homestead, the air did not carry the stagnant, bone-deep chill of survival. It was thick with the suffocating, glorious heat of a massive, cast-iron cooking range. Clara stood before the black iron stove. She did not wear torn silk, nor did she wear the oversized, desperate rags of her first winter. She wore a tailored, heavy canvas dress dyed a deep indigo, reinforced at the knees and elbows with cured leather. Her face bore the fine, sun-baked lines of a woman who spent her days in the wind, a profound map of weathering that held more genuine authority than any powdered aristocrat. She plunged her hands into a massive, wooden kneading trough. Her hands were still thick with yellow calluses, the knuckles permanently broadened, the scars from the rusted shears shining pale against her tanned skin. She poured a measure of coarse, stone-ground wheat, followed by a heavy glug of raw mountain honey and a block of salted butter. In my father's house, Clara thought, the internal echo entirely devoid of pain, ringing only with the steady, heavy thrum of deep-rooted peace. Wealth was measured by the thinness of the porcelain and the whiteness of the hands that held it. It was a fragile, worn-thin illusion that shattered the moment the ledgers tipped. But this flour is heavy. This iron stove burns with wood we chopped ourselves. The wealth of this house is not locked in a bank vault. It is carved into the calluses of my palms and the sweat on my brow. It is a salt-of-the-earth fortune that no thief can ever forge away. She drove the heels of her hands into the dense dough. The physical exertion was no longer a desperate fight against weakness. It was a rhythmic, powerful dance of absolute mastery. The smell of the activating yeast rose in the stifling heat, a primal, deeply comforting scent of damp grain and life. She slapped the heavy mounds of dough onto the floured iron baking sheets, the wet thwack echoing solidly off the stone walls. As she opened the heavy iron door of the oven, the radiant heat blasted against her face, a fierce, glowing embrace that smelled of crackling pine pitch and rendered fat. She did not flinch from the fire. She controlled it. Outside, the heavy metallic ring of a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil shattered the afternoon quiet. Clara wiped the flour from her brow with the back of her wrist and walked to the thick glass window. The frost no longer formed skeletal fingers on the pane. The glass was clear, offering a perfect view of the sprawling yard. Under the wide overhang of the barn stood Elias. The giant's dark hair was now heavily streaked with iron gray, and the thick beard he wore was completely white at the chin. He stood at the heavy anvil, the massive, coiled muscles of his shoulders flexing as he brought a heavy hammer down onto a glowing piece of rusted iron. The mountain had taken its toll all those years ago. The crushed leg had never perfectly healed. When Elias moved, he walked with a heavy, pronounced limp, his right boot scuffing the packed dirt with a rhythmic, inescapable scrape. He leaned heavily on a thick, gnarled cane carved from the very deadwood pine that had nearly killed him. Yet, the injury had not diminished his terrifying, grounded presence. It had only anchored him deeper into the earth. He was a monolith of scarred stone, unyielding and permanent. Sitting on a wooden barrel next to the anvil, watching the giant with unblinking, slate-gray eyes, was a boy of 6, Thomas. He was named for the brother lost to the avalanche, but he carried the undeniable, fierce set of Clara's jaw. The boy did not flinch as the sparks flew from the anvil, showering the hardscrabble dirt like dying stars. Elias lowered the hammer. The ringing of the iron slowly faded into the vast silence of the valley. The giant did not speak. He picked up a pair of heavy iron tongs, gripping the cooling horseshoe, and hobbled slowly over to the water trough. The hot metal hit the freezing water with a violent, spitting hiss, sending a thick plume of white steam into the air. He pulled the blackened iron out and handed it to the boy. "Feel the weight." Elias rumbled, his voice still that deep, chest-vibrating scrape of distant rockfall. "Iron doesn't lie. Tommy, you heat it, you strike it, you shape it. If your hand is weak, the iron stays crooked. You understand?" Thomas took the heavy, warm horseshoe in his small, dirt-smudged hands. He didn't offer a childish, eager nod. He mirrored his father's stoic stillness, running his thumb over the hammered edge. "I reckon the iron remembers the hammer," the boy said, his voice quiet but incredibly steady for his age. Elias looked down at his son. The thick, jagged scar on his cheek pulled tight as the corners of his eyes crinkled in the absolute rarest expression the frontier ever saw. A silent, deeply buried smile. He reached out with a hand the size of a dinner plate, his thick, leather-like fingers resting gently on the boy's shoulder. The weight of that hand was a transfer of an entire world view. It was a promise that the boy would never rely on paper, but only on the strength of his own spine. When the sun finally dipped behind the jagged western peaks, bleeding a final, bruised purple across the sky, the heavy oak door of the cabin opened. Elias stepped inside. The rhythmic thump, scrape of his cane and boot announcing his arrival. He brought the fierce smell of crushed sage, cold wind, and horse sweat into the warm, bread-scented air of the kitchen. Thomas ran past him, carrying an armful of split kindling, dropping it heavily into the wood box next to the roaring stove before racing upstairs to the loft. Elias moved to the splintered oak table. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt, the massive Colt revolver still meticulously oiled and ready, and laid it down with a heavy, final clatter. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, letting it fall over the back of a chair, and sank onto the bench with a heavy, ragged sigh. His stiff legs stretched straight out in front of him. Clara walked over to the table. She carried a steaming cast-iron skillet filled with roasted elk meat, wild onions, and thick, dark gravy, setting it down directly on the scarred wood. She did not ask if his leg pained him. The frontier did not abide useless questions. Instead, she poured a heavy mug of black boiling coffee and slid it across the table until it rested against his thick knuckles. Elias wrapped his massive, scarred hands around the tin mug. He looked up at her, the slate gray of his eyes reflecting the warm, dancing orange light of the hearth fire. "The north fence held," Elias said, his voice low and vibrating. "The herd is bedded down. The wind is shifting east. It will be a quiet night." Clara sat across from him. She reached out, her thick, calloused fingers resting over the back of his massive, ruined hand. The touch was not frantic or desperate. It was the heavy, immovable connection of two rusted chains linking together to hold back the dark. "Let the wind blow," Clara said, her voice a steeled, low murmur that carried the absolute confidence of the guardian. "There is nothing out there in the dark that is heavier than what we have built in the light." The silence that settled over the cabin wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a town holding its breath in judgment, nor was it the terrifying, freezing quiet of a blizzard preparing to bury the weak. It was a hardscrabble peace. It was the quiet of the mountain itself, immovable, scarred by the ice, yet standing tall against the sky, unbothered by the wolves that howled at its base. The fire in the iron pot-belly stove does not ask for the pedigree of the wood it consumes. It does not care if the timber was cut from the manicured gardens of a sprawling estate or dragged from the brutal, wind-scoured ridges of the alkali flats. It only demands that the wood is dry, heavy, and willing to burn. This is the absolute, unyielding truth of the hardscrabble earth. In the sprawling towns and the velvet-lined parlors of high society, men measure a person's worth in worn-thin ledgers, in the crispness of imported banknotes, and in the hollowed-out whispers of public reputation. They build entire empires on the fragile illusion of paper and ink, believing that a sealed writ or a forged account can dictate the value of a human soul. But the winter wind does not read. The blizzard does not respect a title. When the rot sets into the floorboards and the freezing rain strips away the silk, the frontier demands a different currency altogether. Worth, out here in the brutal quiet twixt the mountains, is not something you are born into. It is something you hammer out of the rusted scrap of your own ruin. The town merchants look at a scarred face and see a tragic deformity. They look at hands thick with yellow calluses, stained with lanolin grease and dried dirt, and they feel a righteous, pitying disgust. They do not understand that these are not marks of degradation. A blister that bleeds, scabs, and hardens into a callus is the physical manifestation of a spirit refusing to break. The jagged line across a man's cheek or the permanent limp of a crushed leg are not badges of failure. They are receipts. They are the brutal, undeniable proof that the mountain tried to take you. The wolves tried to claim you, and the bitterness of the world tried to bury you, and you stood your ground. You survived. You became the salt of the earth. I used to believe I was the sum of what other people said about me. Clara's internal echo whispers, a sound now indistinguishable from the steady, rhythmic draw of the wind against the thick stone walls. I thought my value was tied to the blue silk I wore, the grand staircase I descended, and the wealthy man who stood beside me. When they stripped me of my name and threw me into the frozen mud, I thought my life was over. I believed the silence of my exile was a tomb. I did not realize it was an anvil. The cruelty of my father and the betrayal of Julian did not destroy me. They merely burned away the fragile, useless parts of my soul, leaving only the iron behind. I reckon the greatest tragedy of my life was not losing my fortune. The greatest tragedy was how long I spent believing a hollowed-out coward held the pen that wrote my worth. And what of the giant? The men who hide behind locked doors fear a man like Elias. They see his massive frame, his unyielding stare, and the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his hip, and they assume he is a creature of mindless violence. They cannot comprehend the profound, devastating peace of his silence. His quiet is not an absence of thought. It is a heavy, defensive wall built to protect a heart that understands the exact, agonizing weight of loss. He did not buy a ruined girl's debt because he wanted a servant. He bought it because he recognized a fellow traveler standing at the edge of the abyss, and he refused to let the avalanche take another soul. True love on the frontier is not declared with poetry or diamond rings. It is spoken in the act of dropping a heavy wool blanket over shivering shoulders. It is the absolute trust of handing a woman a rusted iron blade and knowing she will not cut the meat. It is standing side by side in the suffocating dark, holding the lantern steady while the wolves circle. The embers in the stove slowly fade from a violent, roaring orange to a deep, sullen red, pulsing like the slow, steady heartbeat of the valley itself. The storm has passed, leaving only the vast, immaculate, white canvas of the wilderness, indifferent to the petty triumphs and tragedies of the towns left far behind. The hardscrabble earth offers no apologies, but it offers absolute freedom to those willing to bleed for it. And so, the wind carries a final, heavy question through the rusted pines, asking the dark directly, when the world turns its back on you, when the ledgers declare you bankrupt and the crowd strips away your name, do you surrender to the cold, or do you pick up the heavy iron? If you find yourself cast out into the freezing night, stripped of everything you thought you were, would you have stayed in the silence?